In 1881, Tombstone saw 3 men gunned down in 32nd in broad daylight in the middle of town, surrounded by witnesses, and nobody went to jail. But even before that, a year earlier, a man named T.J. Waters bought a new shirt. 6 hours later, he was bleeding out in the doorway of a saloon, only because someone joked about it. Now, how the heck do you stay alive in a town where a bad joke is a death sentence? And what kind of place lets a shootout decide who gets to wear the badge? This episode is about a town that was built on silver, fueled by blood, and kept alive by a myth. But to really understand Tombstone, you've got to start way before Ed Schieffelin ever showed up. You see, before any towns, before roads or fences, people were already living in the San Pedro River Valley. Long before Tombstone, go back 10,000 years, and you'd find hunters out there, tracking mammoths, if you can believe that. Clovis people, they're called now. And they left behind stone tools and bones in dry creek beds. But then over time, other groups came through. Folks like the Cochise, Mogollon, and Hohokam. They stayed longer, farmed the land, built villages, raised families, lived with the river, not against it. And when the Spanish showed up, the Sobai Puri were the ones living along the river. They were part of the O'odham, related to today's Tohono O'odham. Good farmers from what we know. They had their own way of doing things. By then, this whole area was already connected to wider trade and travel paths. The Spanish called one of those routes the Cibola Trail. It led north, toward places they thought were full of gold. Maybe explorers like Cabeza de Vaca or Coronado passed through here, but nobody can say for sure. Then, in 1692, an Italian Jesuit priest named Eusebio Kino came through. He followed the rivers San Pedro and Babocomari, and then he stopped at villages along the way. He might have brought the first cattle here, unless some of Coronado's animals survived earlier. Hard to tell. Either way, livestock started showing up not long after, but then the raids started. By the 1760s, Apache groups, mainly the Chiricahua and Western Apache, they were pushing into the valley, and that drove out most of the settlers and many of the Sobai Puri. But not all of them left, though. Some hung on into the 1780s, and even after the written records stopped mentioning them, archaeologists kept digging up signs they were still around into the 1800s. A lot of native groups today, like the Tohono O'odham, Apache, Hopi, and Zuni, still trace family ties to this valley. Anyhow, later on, in the 1820s, fur trappers started showing up. Americans mostly, chasing beaver. A guy named James Ohio Patty came through in 1826 with his father. They followed the Gila and San Pedro rivers. Patty called the San Pedro the Beaver River after how well they did. But that run ended bad. They got hit hard by Apaches. It was probably the Aravipa band. It happened near a place now called Malpass Hill. The trappers lost over 200 pelts in that fight, but it could have been worse. Might have been. Then in 1846, the Mormon battalion passed through. U.S. soldiers. They were marching across the Southwest during the Mexican-American War. And they didn't fight any people here, just bulls. You see a herd of wild cattle charge their wagons, and they spooked the mules and smashed gear. So they ended up shooting dozens of the animals to stop the madness. And that was the only battle they fought. A few years later, Mexico was falling apart, and Santa Anna needed money, fast. So the U.S. sent James Gadsden to strike a deal. And on December 30, 1853, they signed a treaty. The U.S. would pay $15 million for a chunk of land, 45,000 square miles of it, below what's now New Mexico, and in return, they promised to stop cross-border raids. However, Mexico dropped its demand that the U.S. pay damages for native attacks, and since Santa Anna was desperate, he took the offer. But Congress didn't like the terms. Too messy and too expensive, they thought, so they rewrote it. They cut the land to 29,670 square miles only. Then they slashed the price to $10 million. They also took out the bits about U.S. responsibility for claims and raids. President Pierce signed the new version in April 1854, and Santa Anna agreed in June. That deal, which they call the Gadsden Purchase, set the current southern border of the U.S. in this region, at least on paper. Fights and disputes kept going after that. The Apaches, nevertheless, still held the land. They controlled this part of the Southwest long after the treaty was signed. But U.S. settlers didn't really move in until the 1870s. For instance, in 1877, a group of Mormon settlers came back. They built what would become the town of St. David. They chopped trees from the Huachuca Mountains. They transported the timber out, and they supplied lumber to Fort Huachuca, and later to Tombstone. And that's basically how the place started changing, for good or bad, depending on who you ask. And then came the men with picks and dreams, and that's when everything changed. Now, here's how it went. At least as close as I can tell. You see, this fella, Ed Schieffelin, he was out there poking around in country most folks didn't want to set foot in. Apache land. Now, this was rough and dry land and full of bad stories. He was looking for rocks mostly. The kind that might make a man rich, but not everyone saw the point in that. Not out there at least. But Ed had this idea in his head, and it just stuck. And he wasn't new to this. He'd been chasing gold and silver since he was a teenager. He left Oregon in 1865 with not much more than a pick and a plan. He wandered around for years. Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, California. But nothing really came of it. Just a lot of dirt and disappointment. But by the time he hit 30, he found himself down in southern Arizona. And at that time, there weren't many white folks out there yet. It was too dangerous. Like I said to you, the Chiricahua Apache still called it home. And they weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. But still, Ed kept nosing around, and he wasn't the first to try. You see, there'd been another guy, Brunkow, German-born fellow, and he'd set up a mine. Way back in 58. Didn't end well for the poor fella. Brunkow and 2 others got murdered in 1860. Nobody knows exactly how or why. Maybe it was workers turning on him, maybe something else. Either way, folks started calling it the bloodiest cabin in Arizona. And on a side note, now between then and 1890, over 20 people died in or around that spot. So yeah, some say it's cursed. Still, that didn't stop Ed. He took a job at Camp Huachuca in 1877. Army post, newly built. It was meant to bring some law to the area. Ed worked as a scout. Basically, he got paid to wander around the land he was already curious about. And when he was off duty, he'd head east to the San Pedro River, poking around the gullies and washes, looking for signs of ore. Now, the other scouts thought he was off his rocker, as it was too dangerous to be out there alone. Al Seabird, another scout, and a friend of his, told him straight up, "The only rock you'll find out there will be your own tombstone." Turns out that comment stuck with Ed. Eventually, he left the job and went full-time into the desert with nothing but him, his tools, and that gut feeling he couldn't shake. And then one day, finally, he hit something. Silver. He found it in this flat spot called Goose Flats. He didn't waste time. He took some samples and headed north to find his brother Al, who was working at another mine. They then took the samples to this guy, Richard Gerd. Gerd knew his stuff. He said the best piece at $2,000 a ton. That was big money back then. Ed, however, didn't have a dime to work the claim, so Gerd offered cash and know-how in exchange for a share. And with that, they all shook hands. Ed, Al, and Gerd. And that was it. The deal was done. They made it back to a cabin near the San Pedro and got to work. The ball was open, they used to say. Soon other men showed up looking for work. Then tents, then more, and word spread fast. What started as a camp turned into a town almost overnight, and so they called it Tombstone. By early 1879, things were moving pretty fast. They'd formed the Tombstone Mill and Mining Company that January, and by April, a guy named J.B. Allen built the first actual house in town, corner of 4th and Allen Streets. He ran a store out of it, just a small wooden structure, but it marked the switch from tents to something more permanent. And most of the early buildings were wood, quick to go up, easy to tear down, but also easy to burn. Fires hit it hard over the years. That's why today most of the buildings you see in Tombstone aren't the originals from the 1880s, and you see a lot of them had to be rebuilt. That's just how it was with boomtowns, but we'll talk more about these fires later on. For now, word got out quick about the silver. By fall of 79, thousands of people had rolled into town. Now, we're talking miners, gamblers, saloon keepers, anyone looking for a shot at fortune. They pitched canvas tents right on top of some of the richest silver veins Arizona had ever seen. And by the end of that year, things were really taking off. As for the Schieffelin brothers, they had 2 mines pulling in crazy numbers, projected to pay out $50,000 a month, steady, for the next couple of years. Now that's not pocket change, not by any means. That's some life-changing money. In December 1879, the town became formal. Folks voted to incorporate it as a village. The county supervisors gave it the nod, and just like that, Tombstone was official. William A. Harwood got picked as the first mayor, and somehow, around the same time, Ed and his brother decided to cash out. They sold off their shares in the mines. Ed ended up having more money than he'd ever dreamed of. He got married and moved to California, but it didn't really stick. You see, the gold bug never let go of a man, and after a while, he packed up his tools again and headed north, back to Oregon, chasing a good old feeling. And that's where it ended for him. They found him one day in his cabin, lying on the floor, dead, just 49 years old. But back then, he'd asked to be buried back in Tombstone. Said he wanted to go out the way he came in, dressed in his old prospector clothes with his pick and canteen beside him. And so they did. Meanwhile, Tombstone kept growing. They called it the town too tough to die. The name stuck, and with silver flowing, somewhere between $40 and $85 million by some estimates. So it became a magnet, and everyone was chasing something. Same as Ed. So yeah, just like that, a tent camp started turning into a real town. Now, back in January of 1880, they held another election in Tombstone. A guy named Allen Crandall got the mayor's seat, and on the council, there was Comstock, Harry B. Jones, Caldwell, Smith, and Gray. Names you'd hear around town, depending on who you were talking to. And by March 20, that same year, they finished the first railroad line connecting Tombstone to Tucson. Now that changed things. Big time. We're talking quicker travel, easier shipping. And with that, news started to move faster. And although the mining boom was already stirring around then, word got out about the gird mill doing well. And that's when things really started to move. Even more folks showed up. And that meant more noise, which also meant more money. Tombstone was now turning into something bigger, whether the town wanted it or not. And by then they had over a dozen big general stores. You could find almost anything. Mix of this and that. The basics, sure, but also little luxuries that didn't used to be around. Heck, even 4 hotels had popped up, and 9 restaurants, and 2 drugstores, and 10 cigar shops, and a candy factory, which seems odd now, but it made sense. Miners, travelers, kids, they all had a sweet tooth. But aside from that, there was still a lot more. There was also one photo gallery, 2 guys fixing watches, 2 making saddles and harnesses, a couple of shops dealing in stoves and tinware, 2 bakeries. Heck, there was even an ice cream saloon, believe it or not. Yeah, they also had furniture stores, boot shops, dry goods places, millinery for the ladies, and one big store just for furnishing goods, whatever that meant. Banking too. The Pima County Bank set up shop, and Safford, Hudson, and Company wasn't far behind. Even more, there were 5 assay offices back then, which tells you how serious people were about the silver. And of course, saloons. Always saloons. And what else? Oh yeah, September of that year, 1880, the Grand Hotel opened its doors. Now, that's one fancy place, but then so did the Russ House. Folks called it the best spot for travelers in Tombstone. Rooms and meals were 50 cents a pop. And if you wanted to stick around longer, it was $8 a week for board. Not bad, all things considered. By 1881, the population had swelled up to 6, maybe 7,000 people, depending on who you asked. No one had a perfect count, but it felt full, like the town's veins was bursting from steroid overuse. And by the start of this year, Tombstone got its first telegraph lines running through the area. So suddenly, you could send word just like that. It changed how people did business, how they handled trouble, how news spread. Even more out on the edges, smaller places started to form around the mines and stamp mills. Little canvas towns, nothing permanent yet, but enough to draw people in. And this is where the cowboys come in. And no, I'm not talking about the kind from the dime novels. These were rough men, ranchers sure, but also rustlers. You see, they ran cattle in from Mexico, stolen mostly. Then they sold it cheap to feed the growing towns. However, everyone knew it was stolen, but no one wanted to talk too loud about that. After all, beef was beef. Prices were low, and folks were hungry. It was a twisted kind of market. Cowboys had the supply, and the towns had the need. And that worked for a while. But as the silver got smelted into bullion, and these makeshift towns started feeling like real places, the cowboys didn't just want to sell beef anymore. And so, they started demanding things. Control, space, respect maybe, or just more money. Hard to say exactly what they were after, but you could feel it. Something was gonna give. And let me tell you one of those stories that sounds made up, but it actually happened. So it's July 24, 1880. TJ Waters decides to do 2 things that day. First, he buys himself a new shirt. Black and blue plaid. Real loud looking thing. Then he goes out drinking, which was not unusual for the time. But what he didn't count on was that shirt turning out to be the reason he'd end up dead. Yeah. You see, he's wearing it around town, then ends up on Whiskey Row, which was full of saloons and full of men with too much time and liquor in them. So a few of them start cracking jokes about the shirt. Just teasing. Nothing serious. But Waters doesn't take it that way. Maybe he was already too far into the bottle. Maybe he just had a temper. Either way, he snaps. He stands up loud enough for everyone to hear and says, "If any man here don't like my shirt, let him get up. I'm boss here, and I'll knock any man down who opens his mouth about my shirt again." Now, enter E.L. Bradshaw. Guy walks into the saloon, hasn't heard any of this. Then he sees Waters in that ridiculous shirt. He smiles. And then he makes a comment. Now just a friendly jab. Probably didn't even mean anything by it. Waters, however, doesn't ask questions. He simply drags off and knocks Bradshaw out cold. Bradshaw wakes up later, still rattled, but now he's mad. So what does he do next? He finds himself a gun. Then he tracks Waters down, and Waters, he was standing in the doorway of Corrigan's saloon, and that was when Bradshaw shoots him 4 times. Waters was already falling by the second shot, and by the 4th, he was done. As a result, Bradshaw gets arrested, but that didn't mean much. Judge Gray handled it, and Bradshaw walked free. And that was the way of things back then. You shot a man, but if the story lined up right, or if the other guy had it coming, you might just go home. Waters, however, didn't. They buried him at Boothill. I'll talk more about Boothill later on, but for now, all of this was happening while Tombstone's just exploding. Yeah, the town was still finding its feet. And I did mention there were tons of saloons earlier, but I never told you how many. You see, by 1881, they'd counted over 100 of them, maybe even 110. Brothels and gambling joints too, all feeding off the mostly male crowd who were chasing silver and trying to blow off steam. But then again, it wasn't all vice. Churches went up too. Catholic, Methodist, you know, the usual. Even newspapers started printing there, and the Tombstone epitaph was one of them. Heck, did I mention that even an opera house opened up in Tombstone back then? Yeah, they really did. Tombstone even had an ice plant. Now you gotta picture that. Blocks of ice in the middle of the desert. Oh, that's how much money there was coming in. And to give you a better picture, remember when I talked about that railroad from Tombstone to Tucson? Well, aside from shipping ore, this line also brought in plenty of supplies. I'm talking about fresh seafood for those high-end meals the rich folks wanted. Yeah, seafood in the desert in the 1880s. Crazy. And sometime in the year 1881, Tombstone had become the seat of the new Cochise County. They also started building a big courthouse that year too. Took until 1883 to finish, but it was something solid, something meant to last. But even with all that progress, it didn't take long for things to get rough. Back then, being a lawman in Tombstone was a tough job. It could get you killed. And while Fred White was the town's first marshal, he tried to keep order to the best he could. But then one night, on October 30th, 1880, he crossed paths with a drunk outlaw named Curly Bill Brocius. It was dark. Things got tense, and Curly Bill ended up shooting him. Now, people say it was an accident, and maybe it was, but it doesn't matter much because Fred died. That same night, however, Virgil Earp stepped in as acting town marshal. Just like that. Yeah, Fred was gone, and someone had to take over. Needless to say, Virgil wasn't new to law work. A while before all that, in November of '79, he'd been made a deputy U.S. Marshal for the Arizona Territory. And being a marshal meant that he was federal, not just local law. You see, he and his brother Wyatt would come down from Prescott together. probably figuring Tombstone needed some kind of law and order. And long story short, Curly Bill was arrested by Wyatt. Assisting him was his younger brother, Morgan. And that's how it usually went with the Earps. They stuck close. One of them got into something the others weren't far behind. So Virgil ended up holding 2 jobs at once, federal and local. But the town job didn't last long. Less than 2 weeks, actually. Then a guy named Ben Sippy beat him out in a special election. It was close, but Sippy won. And when Tombstone officially became a city a few months later in January of '89, Sippy ran again. This time, however, Virgil didn't bother to run against him. No one knows why exactly. Maybe he was tired of the politics. Maybe he just didn't care. Either way, Virgil had been around, and he didn't come out west just to play sheriff. You see, he'd seen a lot by the time he showed up in Tombstone, and he wasn't flashy about it. But he'd been in fights, done the job, and he didn't hesitate when things got ugly. That's just who he was. Anyways, back to Tombstone. The first big fire hit town on June 22nd, 1881. It burned through the east side of the business district. 66 businesses went up in smoke. Yeah, just like that. Half the town's economy gone in one blaze. 2 weeks earlier, however, Marshal Ben Sippy had asked for some time off. He said he needed a couple of weeks away. Nobody knows why, stress maybe, or money trouble, or something else. So the city council agreed and put Virgil Earp in as acting marshal while Sippy was out. So when the fire hit, Sippy was nowhere around. Virgil was the one left trying to hold things together. And after the flames burned out, there was looting. That always happens. People take advantage when things are falling apart. And it fell on Virgil to deal with it. But then came June 28th. There was still no sign of Sippy. And that's when folks started digging around in his office and found he'd left behind a mess. $3,000 in shady debts, missing funds, maybe worse. Mayor John Clum had seen enough. He went ahead and made Virgil the permanent marshal. So now, no more acting. He had the job. But that was just the surface. Underneath, things were really starting to crack. You see, Tombstone had grown fast, too fast, and people brought their politics and grudges with them. Most of the town folk were Republicans, Northerners, Union men. But a lot of the ranchers outside town were Southern, Confederate sympathizers, and some of them didn't care much for laws or who enforced them. That included families like the Clantons and the McClorys. Some were rustlers, some just shady, but they didn't hide it. Then there was that group that we talked about before, the Cowboys. They were sort of like a gang, sort of not. Loose bunch, mostly outlaws. Some were Texans, some from Mexico, some from who knows where. And like I said earlier, they ran stolen cattle from Sonora over the border into Arizona, then sold it off in town. But again, nobody stopped them because the law was scarce. And territorial courts didn't have much reach either, so the Cowboys acted like they owned the place. Names like Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory, Johnny Ringo, John and Finn Clanton, they were all part of it. And they didn't like the Earps, didn't trust them, didn't want them around, and didn't take orders from them. Curly Bill Brocious, the guy that was arrested before, yeah, he was one of them too. The Earps, for their part, weren't saints either, but they saw themselves as the line between law and anarchy. This time, however, Virgil had the badge, and his brothers Wyatt and Morgan backed him up. Then there was Doc Holliday, drifter, gambler, dentist, killer. He was sick and mean, but he was loyal to Wyatt, and that made him dangerous. But you see, the fighting between the Earps and the Cowboys didn't happen all at once. it sort of built up, piece by piece, over months. Threats, dirty looks, accusations, stagecoach robberies. Everyone knew something was coming, just didn't know when. Part of Virgil's job was enforcing city rules, like the one against carrying guns inside town limit, and that law was already in place before he took the job. However, some stories like to say he made it up, but that's not true. He just enforced it, and that's what led to the trouble. You see, what happened was Virgil, as city marshal, went out with Morgan, Wyatt, and Doc to disarm Frank McClory and Billy Clanton. Now, they didn't want to fight, at least that's what he said, but then things had gone too far and the Cowboys weren't going to back down. And the Earps weren't going to look weak. So yet, it was only a matter of time. Like I said, tension built up over months. Words were said. Threats got thrown around. Then one morning, on October 26, 1881, it finally blew up. People call it the gunfight at the OK Corral, but that's not exactly true. You see, it happened down the street a bit, in a narrow lot off Fremont. Now, folks like to paint Wyatt Earp as the big name, the main man in all this, and yeah, he's the one who got the legend, but if we're talking real experience, it was Virgil, not Wyatt. You see, Wyatt had worn a badge before, in Wichita and in Dodge. He knew the job, but like I said earlier, he hadn't seen the kind of hard stuff Virgil fought in the Civil War. When that kind of thing changes a man, gives him a sense of what death looks like when it's right in your face. But anyhow, after the war, he bounced in and out of law work. So when the fight came, he'd been through worse. On the other hand, Wyatt by then had been in, maybe, one shootout. Morgan, however, hadn't seen any gunfighting at all. And over on the other side, Billy Claiborne had been in one. He was the only one of the Cowboys that had tasted something close to real gun trouble. Unless you count Skeleton Canyon. Yeah, that was a rough deal. But it wasn't the same kind of face-to-face shooting. That mess involved the McClorys and Clantons, too. Now, what happened was, in July 1881, Curly Bill Brocious heard word that Mexican smugglers were transporting silver through Skeleton Canyon into Arizona. So Curly Bill, along with about 20 of his buddies, Johnny Ringo, Jim Crane, the whole crew, they set up an ambush. They struck fast, killed 4 smugglers. Then they made off with $4,000 in bullion and livestock. However, that attack didn't sit well. You see, 2 months later, Commandant Neri fired back. He sent a unit of rurales, led by Captain Carrillo, straight across the border. And this time, they flipped the script. In what came to be called the Guadalupe Canyon Massacre, the Cowboys got hit hard. 5 of them died, including Old Man Clanton and Jim Crane. A brutal payback, but not exactly shocking for the Wild West. And as for Doc Holliday, like I said earlier, he was another name that gets tossed around like he was some kind of gunslinger from hell. But the truth is, most of it came from his own mouth. Just like Wild Bill Hickok and who knows who else. The point is, there were no real records, just stories, a few saloon scraps, a couple of drunks pulling pistols. That's about it. Now, Jeff Morey, the historian who dug into all this, figured the Earps were telling it straight. Based on the testimonies, he believed they weren't out there to ambush anyone. Still, no one agrees who shot first. Again, it depends who you ask. As far as we know, the air got filled with black powder smoke fast, and this made it hard to see, harder to tell who fired what. Around 30 shots in half a minute. That's what they say. Virgil said 2 shots went off at the same time, and that one of them was Billy's. Wyatt, on the other hand, said that Billy aimed at him, but Wyatt didn't shoot back at Billy. He supposedly went for Frank. The first 2 shots were fired by Billy Clanton and myself, Wyatt testified. He's shooting at me and I shooting at Frank McClory. Jeff Morey believed that too. He thought Billy missed, but Wyatt didn't. Said his first shot caught Frank in the stomach. Most folks, however, said the first shots came almost at the same time, maybe a half second apart. And then afterward, everything went loud. Real loud. Gunfire broke out fast and wild. So yeah, no one could say for sure who pulled first. Virgil and Wyatt both thought Tom McClory had a gun. Said he went for his hip. Virgil claimed Tom ducked behind a horse and started shooting over the saddle. One witness saw Doc Holliday pull out a big bronze-colored pistol from under his coat. Probably that coach gun Virgil gave him. Doc stepped out from behind the horse, pointed it at Tom, and then fired both barrels right into his chest, up close. He didn't even hesitate. A man named Hamlight said he saw Tom stagger back down Fremont, heading west toward 3rd. Apparently he made it as far as a telegraph pole, then dropped. Didn't move after that. Valley saw him too. Said Tom stumbled, turned, then hit the ground hard, flat on his back. Doc apparently tossed the shotgun, pulled his revolver, and kept firing. Aimed at Billy Clanton and Frank McClory. Now, Clanton had been running his mouth for months, saying he'd kill an Earp or Holliday sooner or later. But the second bullet started flying. He changed his tune. Ran straight at Wyatt, yelling that he was unarmed, begging not to be shot. And Wyatt told him, "Go to fighting or get away." So, Ike took off. He ran inside Fly's boarding house and got out. Some folks said he fired a pistol before he ran. Maybe. Maybe not. Again, a lot of this depends on who you ask. Billy Claiborne didn't stick around either. He didn't have a gun. Same with Wes Fuller. Both of them ran as soon as shooting started. The Tombstone epitaph wrote that Wyatt Earp stood up and fired in rapid succession, as cool as a cucumber, and was not hit. That's how they put it. But whether or not he was that calm, he stayed on his feet and kept shooting. Morgan, on the other hand, fired at Billy Clanton as Billy was drawing his pistol. Caught him in the wrist. So Billy had to switch hands, but he didn't stop. He kept pulling the trigger till his gun was empty. Virgil and Wyatt kept firing too. And at some point, Morgan tripped over a pipe buried in the ground. He went down hard and shot from the ground. Afterward, Wyatt shot Frank McClory again, this time in the belly. Frank then grabbed the reins of a nearby horse and tried to cross Fremont Street, maybe to get to his rifle. However, he lost control of the animal. It took off, so he held onto his revolver and kept firing. Then it is said that Doc and Frank traded rounds, and one of Frank's bullets grazed Doc across the hip. Didn't stop him, however. Doc shouted, "That son of a bitch has shot me and I'm going to kill him," and went after him. Meanwhile, Morgan got back on his feet and fired again, and Frank didn't make it much farther. He dropped on the east sidewalk, bleeding out. Some folks later said they saw a man walking a horse and shooting behind it. Wyatt thought it was Tom McClory, but Billy Claiborne and Wes Fuller both swore it was Frank. Claiborne said Frank was holding the reins, but lost the horse before ending up in the middle of the street. Even after being hit, both Billy Clanton and Frank McClory kept shooting. One of them, probably Billy, put a bullet through Morgan's back. It passed through both shoulder blades and hit a vertebra. It dropped him, but he got back up. Virgil took a bullet to the leg. He thought Billy shot him, so he fired back at Billy as he limped to one side. Frank made it across the street, still trying to fight. He got 2 more shots off before someone hit him just below. the right ear. And that was the end of it for Frank. Morgan and Doc both claimed they made that shot, but neither of them took the stand. So, we only know what others said. They said. It's also said that a bystander ran over and tried to help Frank. Said he heard him trying to speak, but he couldn't get the words out, so he died right there in the dirt. Billy, on the other hand, was shot up bad. Wrist, chest, gut. He slid down near where he started, propped himself up against a wall next to a window. Claiborne said he was still trying to shoot, resting the pistol on his leg, and when he ran out of bullets, he asked someone for more. But that was it. And as for C.S. Fly, the man who owned the boarding house, he stepped in and took Billy's gun, and with that, the shooting was done. A few minutes after the shooting stopped, they carried Tom McClory into the Harwood house, right on the corner. He didn't say anything. He just died there, quietly. Billy Clanton was brought in too. He was still alive, but in bad shape. Asking for a doctor. Asking for morphine. He said, "They have murdered me. I have been murdered." He was struggling to breathe. He told them, "Chase the crowd away from the door and give me air. Then finally, go away and let me die." And that was it. Meanwhile, Ike Clanton, who'd done plenty of threatening over the years, was running. Still running. William Cuddy saw him tearing down Allen Street. Bayan spotted him later near Tough Nut. Apparently Ike didn't stop to help his brother. Didn't fire a single shot. The bodies of Tom, Frank, and Billy were laid out in the front window of Ritter and Reams. Right there in the glass, and above them, someone hung a sign that said, "Murdered in the streets of Tombstone." Apparently that's how it looked to some. And at the end of the day, Wyatt and Virgil stood by what they'd done. They both said Tom McClory had a gun and he even got off a shot over the back of a horse. As for Billy Clanton and Frank McClory, there's no doubt they fired. Exchanged bullets with the lawmen. The next day, the Tombstone Nugget ran a piece on it. They called it one of the crimson days in the annals of Tombstone, a day when blood flowed as water, a day always to be remembered as witnessing the bloodiest and deadliest street fight that has ever occurred in this place, probably in the territory. Anyway, the story is far from over, so let's stop here. But yeah, the story didn't stay local. It was in newspapers, coast to coast, and most folks backed the Earps. The San Francisco Exchange, for instance, ran a headline that just said, "A good riddance." They weren't exaggerating much. People had seen shootouts before, sure, but not like that. Not right there in the middle of town in broad daylight, with bodies hitting the dirt before bystanders even knew what was happening. It shook people, even the ones who'd seen plenty. However, things didn't settle down after that. Now, after this famous gunfight, a lot happened. And I mean a lot. See if I could talk about it in another episode. But for now, let's go back to Tombstone. You see, 1882 was a busy year, but also a hard one. First off, that courthouse that I mentioned earlier, it was almost ready, and it cost the town about $43,000. It had the county jail in it, along with offices, courtroom upstairs. They also put up a city hall. It wasn't as big, but still, it cost $15,000. And right across Fremont Street from City Hall stood Schieffelin Hall. Now that building was something else. Biggest adobe structure in the Southwest, or so they said. It was where the mine bosses and professionals gathered. Place for theater, music, meetings, not for the common folk. But on May 25th, 1882, everything got turned upside down again. Another fire ran through Tombstone, and this time, it burned out more than 100 businesses. Insane. It took out the OK Corral too. Place had been a landmark, for better or worse. But it was gone now. But the craziest part about Tombstone was the mines. You see, they ran right under the town, and some mine shafts opened smack in the middle of buildings. Vizinia, Gilded Age, Mountain Maid. Names like that, you'd be walking down the street, and right next to you, there'd be a hoist or a pile of ore. So naturally, it led to fights. And this brings us to another problem. You see, titles didn't always line up. One guy owned the lot. Another said he had the claim underground. So yeah, courts had to sort that out more than once. And just outside of town, on the hills, sat the Tough Nut and Contention mines. Those were the big ones. A lot of the big mines in Tombstone ended up in the hands of rich folks from the Northeast. Not locals. Not the guys doing the digging. These were investors. East Coast money chasing Western silver. On average, miners got paid $3.50 for above ground work. $4 if they went below. 8-hour shifts. No weekends, no holidays. Just round the clock, day in and day out. And it didn't matter if it was Christmas or the 4th of July. They were down there swinging picks. And some mines operated for 6 days, 10-hour days a week. The people who actually did the work underground weren't from around there either. Most of them were immigrants from Europe, Cornish miners, Irish laborers, some Germans. They were used to hard rock mining. They knew what they were doing. Tough people. Then there were the Chinese and Mexican workers. They weren't in the mines much, not usually. They did the other jobs like laundries, laying bricks, cooking meals, running hotels and restaurants. The kinds of things that kept the town moving. But even though they weren't competing for mining jobs, a lot of folks didn't like them being there at all. For instance, in the 1880s, people started organizing against them. There was even an anti-Chinese league that tried to shut down Chinese-owned businesses. Real nasty stuff. We're talking boycotts, threats, and worse. The usual pattern when fear and prejudice mix. The town had about 6,000 men on the job, pulling in what would be millions in today's money every week. And like I said, when those guys weren't working, they were spending. Most of them were young, single, and had nowhere else to be. They blew their cash on Allen Street. That was the main drag. Saloons, gambling halls, brothels. All of it wide open, all day, all night. As for how much silver came out of those hills, again, it depends on who's doing the math. Some say 32 million troy ounces. That's 1,000 metric tons, more than any other place in Arizona. In 1883, this guy Patrick Hamilton wrote that the mines had made about 25 million in their first 4 years. That's close to $1 billion today. Other folks throw around numbers as high as 85 million, maybe more. It's hard to pin down because people exaggerate. But then again, people also forget, so. And in the meantime, the town kept going. Sure, but after that, something changed. You could feel it. Again, since Tombstone was a pressure cooker back in the early 1880s, there was a lot of money, a lot of booze, and a lot of guns. So, violence came easy. Between about 1879 and 1893, folks were getting killed left and right. Not just in town either, but out in the mining camps too. You hear different numbers, but it's safe to say at least 28 people, locals, got taken out in gunfights or dragged out and lynched. Probably more if records weren't always exact. Yeah, some things just got lost, or, in the unique case of Tombstone, quietly buried. Yeah, there were a big shootout, but there were also these fast, fierce little bursts of violence that came and went like summer storms. One of the bloodier periods was in 1883 into 84. A gang pulled a robbery down in Bisbee, and it all went down fast. 5 of the outlaws got hanged in Tombstone that March 8th, 1884. Their ringleader, a guy named John Heath, didn't make it to trial. He got sprung out of jail by a mob on February 22, and then got strung up. Now, that's real vigilante justice for you. But one killing folks still talk about, at least the ones who know their stories, is the duel between Luke Short and Charlie Storms. That was February 1881. You see, both men were known names. Storms especially. Wyatt Earp once called him one of the fastest guns in the West, and Wyatt would have known. Indeed, Storms did have a rep, and he was deadly with a 6-shooter. He was older than Luke Short, but not past it. Luke Short wasn't exactly green either. Now, he was a faro dealer at the Oriental, and they called him the Undertaker's friend. Guy had a way of sending folks to the grave. He didn't stick around Tombstone long, but while he was there, he made his mark. Literally. He sent Storms straight to Boothill. But what exactly started their beef? Well, that part's gone. Whatever it was, it ended in the street out front of the Oriental on February 25th. But what we do know is that Storms came in drunk, waving a pistol, making noise. He picked a fight, told Luke Short he was going to kill him, and called him out. And these were both serious men, you know, no amateurs. So people thought Storms had the edge, but what happened was, Storms gave Luke Short the first shot. Might have been a mistake, so Luke Short didn't wait. He managed to score 2 shots to the chest. Storms dropped. He was bleeding bad, but he still tried to fire back. He got some rounds off, but none hit. Luke Short just stood there, then holstered his guns and walked back inside, like he'd only stepped out for a smoke. He sat back down at his faro table. Meanwhile, Storm's body stayed in the street a while, and you can visit Boothill Cemetery now and see the marker. It just says, Charlie Storms, shot by Luke Short, 1881. And in case you're confused about Boothill, yeah, I didn't spell it out in detail. See, it's a graveyard for people who died sudden, usually violent deaths. The kind who didn't get a quiet ending. Gunfights, ambushes, bad deals gone worse. And in Tombstone, Boothill Graveyard sits just outside. It's a dry, quiet place, filled with rocks and weathered wooden markers. Not much grows out there. Maybe some scrub brush, maybe not. It doesn't look like much, but it holds stories. Rough stories. They say about 250 people are buried there, give or take. No one's totally sure. But not all of them were criminals, though. Some were just in the wrong place, or made the wrong call, or trusted the wrong man. It happens. Life back then didn't care who you were. You could be tough, smart, or even lucky. Still didn't mean you'd make it to old age. And although Tombstone had a bunch of cemeteries, this one stuck in people's heads. Maybe because of the name. Maybe because of the stories. You know, Wyatt Earp, the OK Corral, that whole mess. It all left a mark. Nevertheless, Boothill also guards the graves of Chinese workers, cooks, laundrymen, honest folks who built the town. There's also Mrs. Alum, also known as China Mary. She was buried in stone alongside Hoplung, Fuki, and Tongki. We'll talk more about China Mary later on. But yeah, even Quanki lies here. He was a penniless immigrant who left Tombstone, a ranch owner. And then there's Dutch Annie, full name Annie Graves. She ruled the red light district, ran brothels, and loaned money to minors. And when she died in 1883, her funeral was massive. Thousands in buggies, city officials rubbing elbows with underworld folks. She'd helped countless miners get back on their feet. So in some ways, she was sort of a camp angel with grit. And despite the show, her headstone is modest. Dutch Annie, 1883. A small epitaph for someone who lived large. But yeah, after 1883, it was mostly for the kind of people you didn't mourn out loud. Outlaws, I mean. Also drifters, a few unlucky souls who got caught in something messy. And like I said earlier, Boothill also holds folks who didn't make the papers, like James Hickey. That was October 1st, 1881, down in Charleston. You see, Hickey was drunk and looking for trouble. So he saw Billy Claiborne, who was just 19, and he figured the kid would make an easy mark. So then Hickey tailed him from one saloon to another, egging him on, trying to goad him into a fight. Billy tried to shake him. He moved from Ben Woods to J.B. Ayers, then toward Harry Queen's place, and Hickey followed him the whole way. But then Billy warned him, "Stay away from me," but Hickey didn't. And that's when Billy turned, pulled his gun, and shot him, just like that. He hit him between the eyes. Hickey dropped where he stood, right there on the boardwalk. Billy got hauled in by Constable Clark and went to trial here in Tombstone, but the jury let him go. They said Hickey had it coming, and no one wanted to say the kid should have died just because some drunk wanted to act tough. Boothill's full of stories like that. Markers don't say much, but they say enough. Take the one that just reads, Margarita stabbed by a gold dollar. Now that's not some nickname someone made up later. This is what's carved into the wood. And Gold Dollar was the work name of a prostitute. Her real name was Gertie something, but folks called her Little Gertie. She was blonde, small, and easy on the eyes. She had a thing for shiny coins, which is probably where the name came from. You see, she was with this dance hall cowboy, Billy Milgreen. Then along came Margarita. Dark eyes, strong attitude, and she cut in on Gertie's man. She took him too. And so Gertie didn't take that well. From what people say, there was a shouting match, then a scrap, right in front of folks. Margarita got mouthy, and Gertie reached up under her dress like she was adjusting a garter. And then she came out with a knife, which wasn't small either. She stabbed Margarita hard, right under the breastbone, and that was it. Over in seconds. One woman dead, the other one probably crying and bleeding inside, but not from a knife. They buried Margarita, stuck up that marker. The story mostly ended there. Then there was the mess with Mae Woodman. February 23rd, 1883. She shot William Kinsman right there on Allen Street in front of the Oriental. And the whole thing started over a joke. Or at least what someone thought was a joke. What happened was, somebody ran a note in the epitaph saying Kinsman was gonna marry her. Now, maybe they had been living together. Maybe not. Doesn't really matter now. But what does matter is that Kinsman didn't like the rumor, and he made it public. He put out his own ad saying, nope, no plans to marry Mae Woodman. Yet, she didn't laugh. She walked right up to him outside the saloon and put a bullet in him. He dropped. She got 5 years in Yuma for it, but didn't even serve one. Apparently it was too much trouble, even for that prison, so the governor let her go early just to get her out of there. However, Kinsman didn't get a second chance. He's still at Boothill. And then there's Les Moore. He worked for Wells Fargo and NACO down on the border. One day, a guy named Hank Dunstan showed up looking for a package, but it was beat to hell when he got it, so words were exchanged. Then the situation heated pretty fast, and that's when both men reached for their guns. Moore ended up with 4.44s in his chest, dead behind the counter, but not before he managed to squeeze off one shot. You see, that one bullet hit Dunston in the ribs, and he dropped 2. Didn't last long after that. No one really knows where Dunston ended up getting buried, but Moore got a spot in Boothill, and maybe the most famous line in the place. Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a .44, no less, no more. Dark humor, even in death. As time went by, things didn't really slow down much, even toward the tail end of the boom years. For instance, in 1886, a train running out of Nogales, in Mexico to Arizona, got hit. It wasn't only Rob, no. The whole crew got shot dead. Real ugly business. 2 of the bandits, Manuel Robles and Neves Duran, figured they'd lay low for a while. So they went to ground at a camp in the Whetstones. It belonged to Manuel's brother, Guadalupe Robles. Now, Guadalupe wasn't a bad man. He was a woodcutter, worked hard, and he stayed clean. But blood's blood, and when your brother shows up on the run, dragging trouble behind him, you don't always think straight. So he agreed to hide them, just for a little while at least, until they could get across the border. But the problem was, Sheriff John Slaughter had good ears everywhere, and so word got around fast, and it didn't take long before he knew exactly where they were hiding. So Slaughter, Bert Alvord, and another deputy rode out before dawn. They hit the camp just as the light was coming up. It was one of those moments where things happen fast and everyone's half blind. They shot at movement, no names, and no warnings. Guadalupe Robles and Duran bolted from the camp, probably thinking they were being ambushed by robbers. However, Slaughter dropped them both. His brother Manuel caught a bullet from Alvord, but still managed to climb on a horse and get away. He probably bled the whole ride out, and nobody ever saw him again, far as the record shows. And in the end, Guadalupe didn't do anything wrong. Not really. He simply backed the wrong people, and so both he and Duran ended up in Boothill. There's another grave there that stands out from the rest, not because of the death, but because of the life. The marker says, John Swain, Slaughter, born June 1846, former slave who came to Tombstone 1879, died February 8, 1946. Now this guy, he served under Sheriff Slaughter. He outlived almost everyone who passed through town, good or bad. Swain saw Tombstone rise, burn out, and keep limping along through the years. And when he died, the folks at Fort Huachuca and others from around Tombstone paid for the stone. They called him a worthy pioneer, and he was, likewise. Not everyone buried out there went down in a gunfight. Some just died in the way rough men do. John Blair was one of those. He was a rustler with the Double Dope Gang. Rode across southeast Arizona, pushing stolen cattle through scrub and canyons. Yet somewhere out there, he caught smallpox. And by the time he got back to camp, near Tombstone, he was already in bad shape. So his partners didn't want to catch it, so they stuck him in a shack alone. Later on, he found a Mexican woman who'd survived the pox before and paid her to take care of him. She stayed a week, then she came back and just said, Senor Juan, he's very dead. They didn't mess around after that. One of the gang rode into Tombstone, picked a grave spot, and dug it deep. Meanwhile, another gang member went to the shack, but he didn't go inside. He just stood at the door and tossed a rope until it caught Blair's legs. Then he tied it to his saddle horn and dragged the body all the way to the hole. They dumped him in, still tied up, Then they threw the rope in after him and covered him with dirt and rocks. They didn't even put a cross. Nor was there a prayer. In and out. Just like that. That night, sitting drunk around the fire, one of them chuckled and said he wondered how Blair was going to get that rope off his legs when it came time to stand for judgment. And to be honest, nobody knows when Blair was born, and nobody wrote down when he died. But there he is, same as the rest, hole in the ground, stone or no stone. And that's how things ended out here. Some quick, some quiet, but none of it clean. Honest folks, on the other hand, got buried elsewhere. For instance, there's a headstone out in Boothill that says, M.E. Kellogg, 1882, died a natural death. Now, that's rare. As you already know, most folks buried there didn't get that kind of ending. And there's also a separate section nearby for the Jewish dead, still part of the same story, just set apart. Different customs, different rules, but close enough to count. And hey, as we all know, 3 big names from Tombstone managed to dodge Boothill entirely. Doc Holliday, John Slaughter, and Wyatt Earp. Now, Doc, he was as cold as they come in a shootout, but he died in a Colorado hotel room. Tuberculosis took him. That was 6 years after the gunfight at the OK Corral. And as he lay there, coughing and slipping away, he looked around and said, "This is funny." Maybe he meant it was strange. Dying in bed, not in a hail of bullets like everyone figured he would. John Slaughter went the same way, quiet, in bed. He'd been sheriff of Cochise County for 4 years, from 1886 to 1890. He wasn't big on jailing people. Mostly, he just didn't bring them back. He'd shoot them where they stood, and that was his idea of law. And it worked. The county stopped being a hideout for petty crooks. But before he died in Douglas, Arizona, back in 1927, he told them plainly, "Don't bury me in Boothill. I don't want to be buried there because Tombstone will be a ghost town." And he got his way. They put him in the Boothill Cemetery. Anyhow, Boothill today feels different. It's got a health center and a quieter reputation. But in that cemetery, those graves still whisper stories of ambition, loss, payback, and a town that learned to survive. And today, people come from all over now just to walk through the graves, take pictures, read the signs. Some lean in like they're trying to hear the dead talk. And that's Boothill for you. Just the end of the line. The thing is, for a town that size, the death rate was off the charts. One Texas paper even said Tombstone had the highest murder rate per capita in the whole territory. And you know, they were probably right. If you run the numbers, it works out rough. About 165 murders for 100,000 people a year. Or to put it in perspective, that's more than 15 times higher than what big cities had around that same time. Say Chicago had 500,000 people back in 1880. They might have seen 50 murders a year. However, Tombstone, maybe 10. But Tombstone only had about 10,000 people at its peak. So yeah, that ratio's pretty harsh. And if you really want to understand how crazy the West was, you can't just look at how many people got killed in a year. You've also got to think about the odds. How likely it was that a person living there would end up on the wrong end of a bullet over time. Take Dodge City, for example. Between 1876 and 1885, the murder rate there was around 165 out of every 100,000 adults, year after year. That works out to about a 1 in 61 chance of getting murdered if you lived there the whole decade. Now, it doesn't sound like much at first maybe, but if someone told you today that you had a 1 in 61 chance of not making it through the next 10 years because someone might kill you, you'd probably think twice about moving in. other towns weren't faring much better. San Francisco from 1850 to 1865 had 1 in 203. Some California counties sat around 1 in 72. Even Oregon, which had the lowest no murder rate in the West during that era, which was about 30 murders per 100,000. They still came out to a 1 in 208 shot that ended up dead by violence. And you know, those numbers start adding up when you consider how many people were passing through or settling down in these places, thinking they were building a life. And again, despite what folks might imagine, most people in towns like Tombstone weren't outlaws or gunslingers. A historian once put it plainly. 9 out of 10 were just regular folks like miners, merchants, and families trying to get by. Still, as I mentioned earlier, by 1881, Tombstone had 110 saloons and 14 gambling halls crammed into a tight little area. Add in the brothels and dance halls, and you had all the fuel needed to keep the place on edge. Fights, tempers, misunderstandings. Everything boiled quick over there. But it wasn't just vice and violence. Although I mentioned earlier that there were Chinese and Mexican miners working there, Tombstone had a strange kind of balance to it. There were French, Italian, and Chinese restaurants. People went to social clubs. There was a little Chinatown district too. So yeah, Tombstone was a full-on frontier town, running on silver money and high tension. And speaking of people, let's move on to the noteworthy ones. Now, Wyatt Earp, he's the name everyone remembers, but he lived long past all the rest. He left Tombstone behind and kept traveling, and he died old in Los Angeles, of all places. Then, of course, there's Virgil and Morgan Earp and Doc Holliday, of course. Then you got Sheriff John Bean. Now, some say he was a lawman. Others say he just backed the wrong side. Clantons and that crowd. There were also a lot of gamblers and saloon owners who were tangled in it too. Doc's woman, Big Nose Kate, for instance. She ran a brothel later on. She was with him through a lot of it, though they weren't exactly sweethearts in the usual sense. And let's not forget Slaughter, John Horton Slaughter. He did a bit of everything. Lawman, cowboy, gambler, rancher. He fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. Then after that, he stayed in the fight against Indians, outlaws, whoever caused trouble in Arizona or New Mexico. He got a name for being tough. Some feared him, some didn't mind him, but everyone knew not to cross him. And besides these Tombstone old-timers, there were also a bunch of writers and movie men like Louis L'Amour and John Ford. They came through and cleaned it all up. They turned it into stories. They gave it shine. Oh, and as promised earlier, let's not forget about China Mary. See, she wasn't like the others. She didn't wear a badge. She didn't carry a gun, but she ran her part of town like a Mexican general. They called it Hoptown, and she was married to Ah Lum, who co-owned the Con restaurant with another guy, Quang Keel. Ah Lum also headed the Chinese Masonic Lodge, whatever that meant out there. But Mary, she was the one people listened to. Nobody worked unless she allowed it. Didn't matter if you were picking laundry, running a shop, or something less clean. She had to give the okay. She controlled the hiring. She controlled the money. Basically, you didn't get paid unless she said so. And she also ran the opium trade. She controlled prostitution too. Basically, she owned pieces of most Chinese-run businesses in town. In a way, she was the start of what you'd now call the triads, or the Chinese mafia in Arizona. Except she was a solo gangstress of some sort. Strange thing though, people liked her. They respected her. She didn't care what race you were. If you were honest, worked hard, she'd lend you money. No contract and no questions. And if someone was sick or hurt, she took care of it. This one time, a cowboy busted his leg. So she carried him to the Grand Central boarding house and covered his stay until he healed up. And when she died, they buried her in the Chinese section of Boothill. There a big crowd came. Her funeral was a full-on Chinese affair. Bright colors, music, incense. So yeah, nobody forgot her. But hey, she wasn't the only female Tombstone legend. There were other female entrepreneurs too. Take Ellen Cashman, who everyone called Nellie. She too made a name for herself in Tombstone in the 1880s. And she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a prospector, nurse, businesswoman. She wore all those hats across the American West and even Canada. But her Tombstone chapter, that one stands out. Arriving around 1880, she jumped right in and opened a shoe and goods store, then the Tombstone cash store, her own grocery. Then she opened a restaurant called the Russ House, and she even helped start the arcade restaurant, plus a boarding house with her sister. But it wasn't all business for good old Ellen. She was kind enough to kick in cash to build the Sacred Heart Catholic Church, and she helped run the Miners' Hospital. And during an epidemic, she nursed the sick, alongside religious sisters and local prostitutes. She also backed schools, supported Irish causes, and even sheltered her widowed sister and her 5 kids. Legends followed her everywhere she went. When fire threatened her boarding house, folks say she helped douse it. Another tale claims she stood between a mine superintendent and a lynch mob, like a one-woman peacekeeper. And when miners set up bleachers to gawp at a public hanging, Nellie talked them into tearing them down. She stayed on until 1886, then kept on helping and investing, mining, charity, support. She didn't chase gunfights or saloon brawls. She built, healed, and cared. And that's how Nellie Cashman cemented her place in Tombstone's story before moving on to find her fortunes elsewhere. Also, interestingly enough, according to Jewish accounts, people of Jewish heritage first set foot in what's now Arizona during Francisco Vasquez de Coronado's 1540 expedition. You see, some of them were conversos, and these were originally Jewish or Muslim Iberians who were brutally forced into Catholicism during Spain's Inquisition. A great many of them, however, kept their practices alive in secret whenever they could. Now, fast forward to the 19th century, and another name pops up. Nathan Benjamin Appel, a German-born Jew who left New York in 1856. He made his way west, first to St. Louis, then along the Santa Fe Trail to Tucson, which had just become the territory's capital. And in that same century, Arizona saw its first real wave of Jewish settlers who were mostly Ashkenazi folks from the East Coast and California. They too followed the mining and farming boom. And here's another fun fact for you. Tombstone and other towns like Yuma, Prescott, Bisbee, Phoenix, and Tucson even had Jewish mayors between 1883 and 1919. Yes, that's right. Tombstone had a Jewish mayor at one point. Wyatt Earp's common-law wife, by the way, was Jewish too. So were merchants, miners, gunfighters. It was basically the whole Wild West cast. There were some Jewish docs and lawmen too. During Tombstone's boom years, around 75 Jewish families lived there, mostly merchants. Others owned the stationery, cigar and tobacco shop, the Golden Eagle Saloon, and even the local barber shop. There was one barber called Emil Marks who didn't stay long. Legend says he got skittish when Clanton customers rested their 6-shooters on their chests mid-shave. But the most famous Jewish figure in town was probably Josephine Sadie Marcus, a German Jewish stage performer from San Francisco. She met Wyatt Earp in Tombstone and, well, they hit it off. There was also a dentist called Gustav Schieffelin. He set up shop in early 1882. You've also got H. Emanuel at the Watermill Mining Company. Now he stuck around after the silver boom and opened a blacksmith and wagon shop. He was also elected mayor in 1896, and then re-elected in 1898 and 1900. There was also Charles Feldman, who went into mining, as did Seagorin, Herman Lavin, and Steinthal. Then there were bankers like Lionel M. Jacobs, Harry Castle, Albert Springer, and Solomon at Cochise County Bank, a family biz with his brother Barron. A few Jewish guys came from San Diego to Tombstone, seeking to make their fortunes during the boom years. Adolph Levi, Albert Fortlowey with his tobacco store, and Louis Lieneberg from Arco and Hardware. Other Jewish merchants included Philip Gotthelf, who sold tobacco, Elias Laventhal, who ran a general store, barbers John Lippert and Abraham Pizer, Alfred Hartman, a jeweler, Samuel Black, a tailor, and Louis Habel, who owned a furniture store. Oh, and the Summerfield brothers too, Levy, Morris, and Herman. They ran one of the biggest dry goods stores on Fremont Street. And let's not forget Hyman Solomon, another Jewish transplant from San Diego. He managed Oberfelder and Company, a well-known wine and liquor wholesaler. In 1882, he became Tombstone's treasurer. And you know, only 2 Jewish women appear in Tombstone's business records. Mrs. David Gotthelf, who ran a French-style millinery shop, and Mrs. H. Cohen, owner of a fancy dry goods store. But in the end, we don't know exactly how many Jews lived in Tombstone. Between 1881 and 1883, estimates range from 300 to 500. They never really built a synagogue, but records show they held services. But the bottom line is, like so many others back then, Jewish folks came to Tombstone chasing opportunity, and they found it in commerce, in politics, and of course, in Wild West legend. But while names died out and stories got buried, the town itself didn't. Now, out of all the crazy places in Tombstone, the Birdcage Theater was probably the wildest of them all. The New York Times called it the wildest, wickedest night spot between Bassin Street and the Barbary Coast. You see, down in the basement, there was a poker game that started in 1881 and didn't stop for over 8 years. Now think about that for a second. 24 hours a day. How many casinos today have that, eh? And that wasn't the only interesting thing. Get this. Buy-in was $1,000. That's a lot now. But back then, it was enough to buy a house. In the end, however, silver doesn't last. By the mid-1880s, the veins were drying up, so miners started packing out. Then in 1886, a fire wrecked the Grand Central hoist and the pumps that kept water out of the mines. But nobody wanted to cough up the money to rebuild. By 1887, only about 400 people still had jobs in the mines, and silver was down to just over $1 an ounce, and by 1900, it was nearly half that. So, things got quiet. Buildings sat empty, and the place started to decline. Some folks called it a ghost town. Still, a few things held on. In 1902, Tombstone got electricity and a phone system, so it wasn't dead yet, but it was limping. By 1910, fewer than 650 people were still living there. Then in 1912, Arizona became a state, and Tombstone was officially a city now. But between mine floods, fires, And the Depression? Most towns like it would have disappeared. Tombstone, however, didn't. It didn't grow either. It just hung on. And by the 1940s, people started showing up just to see where it all happened. Tourists, writers, history buffs, folks who'd seen westerns and wanted to walk the real streets. That saved it. And little by little, the town got turned into a kind of living museum. They fixed up the old places too. The birdcage, Schieffelin Hall, others. They even fenced in Boothill Cemetery and cleaned up the headstones. By now, around 1,300 people live in Tombstone. And every year, a few 100,000 visitors come through, walking the boardwalks, watching gunfight shows, and poking around buildings that still have bullet holes in the walls. Tombstone never forgot what it was. Apache trails, shootouts, silver strikes, feuds. There's a lot of stories packed into that place. Some good, a lot not so good. But it's all part of it. And the shootout, the one people still talk about, that happened just 5 years after Ed found silver. October 1881. 32 shots in about half a minute. They say it's the most famous gunfight in the history of the West. Probably is. For that moment alone, put Tombstone on the map forever. These days, some wear the old clothes, carry the old guns, act out the same dusty drama over and over. They reenact the OK Corral like it's church. Movie fans glide through too. That '93 film, Tombstone, the one with Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer. It sure put the place back on the map. Folks come just to stand where it all happened, or might have happened. They hold little festivals for it. Also respect to Val Kilmer, who recently passed. He was the heart of Tombstone. Nobody played Doc Holliday like he did. Ride easy, Huckleberry. Then there's Big Nose Kate's place. Now it's a saloon with a stage. Country bands play there. Tourists drink beer and watch the shootout reenactment from a safe distance. And then there was that odd little detail. You see, in 2018, some Vietnamese Buddhist monks showed up. Said they were there because of Wyatt Earp. Nobody knew if they were joking or not, but it stuck in people's minds. And you know, some of the old families never left. One of them, the Escapules, has roots going all the way back. Dusty Escapule's the mayor now. 4th generation. His family's been here since the town was barely more than a couple of tents and a silver dream. The first one, John Escapule, showed up in Arizona back in 1877. He was a French Basque. He came looking for opportunity like a lot of folks back then. John got his start around the time Tombstone was just starting to matter. He met Ed Schieffelin out by the Broom Cow cabin near Charleston, and that's where Ed told him he'd hit pay dirt. Thereafter, he offered John work transporting timber for the mines, and not long after, Ed gave him a stake in one of those mines. And just like that, John was in. But he didn't stop there. He ran an assay office near the OK Corral and married a local woman named Emma Trapman, who passed away in 1907. John, however, stayed put. He bought up land. He even picked up the LTI ranch out in the Dragoons. Now they call it the Three Sisters. He also drove stagecoaches and transported freight. He even wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle for a while. There's a photo of him in old-time clothes that fooled folks for years. People thought it was Doc Holliday, but as it turns out, it was just John. Easy mistake. Same mustache, same lean face, same time period. But historians eventually cleared it up. Anyways, John also got the Watervale Mill, the Lucky Hills Ranch, and a few cattle spots in Texas. He kept going back to the state of Maine mine, on and off until he died in 1926. He and Emma had 5 kids, 1 girl, Emma, and 4 boys. John Jr., Ernest, Joseph, and Louis. The boys stuck with the family line of work. John Jr. leaned into ranching, ran Sheep's Head Ranch, and had land in New Mexico and Texas. The others worked the mines. Later on, grandsons Charles and Louis were still pulling ore out of the state of Maine mine, but by open pit this time. Their company, Tombstone Exploration, used cyanide leaching, a modern setup. And aside from working their own mine, they also leased 87 claims, and they kept at it until the early 80s. Daughter Emma did her part too. She brought the old OK Corral back to life, ran it herself until 26, and then sold it off to the local historical group. Her daughter Anne stuck around town, worked at the courthouse. John Jr. also ended up in the oil game down in Texas. Luckily, he just about gave up on a well. He was drilling when it blew, but then that strike turned into 22 more, and it's still running. EP Escapial Wells, 1 through 23. Then there was Ernest H., the oldest surviving son. He mined everywhere. State of Maine, Santa Ana, even across the border and as far as Malaysia. He and his wife Bernice had 5 kids, and one of them is Dusty. Yes, that very same Dusty that became mayor of Tombstone, which you all know today. He became mayor twice over. He was a deputy marshal too, sitting on the city council. Dusty and his wife Sherry raised 6 kids of their own, and those kids kept it going. So yeah, the Escapulas never really left. They just changed with the times. And as for Boothill, back in the 1940s, a man named Emmett Nunnally looked at Boothill and thought someone ought to do something before it all faded. So he asked the city council for permission to fix it up. By then, however, most of the old wood markers were gone, weathered to nothing or stolen, and Harry Fulton Ohm, who owned the Birdcage Theater back then, had a steel plant in Indiana. He sent out metal markers to replace the old ones. Emmett Nunnally and a few others checked the grave records, asked around, and dug through whatever history they could find. They wanted to get it right. So yeah, thanks to them, Boothill still stands. Markers might be new, but the bones are the same. And when Nunnally died, they honored his wish. They buried him there, alongside the outlaws and lawmen. And then there's Ben Trawick. He's the town historian. Old school type, been writing about this place for decades. He's published a whole stack of books, but the one people point to most is Tombstone's Boothill. It first came out in 1971. He's updated it a few times since. And then today, Dusty Escapula likes to remind folks that Tombstone wasn't all gunfights and whiskey. They had opera, fresh oysters, and so on, like I talked about earlier. And under him, the town leans into all of it. The noise, the legend, the quieter truth behind it. He shows up for reenactments, helps teach kids the history, knows this place is more than a tourist stop. It's where his family started, and where he still shows up to work every day. So yeah, these days, the town leans into the legend. The town too tough to die. But in the end, if Ed Schieffelin hadn't wandered out there with a pick and a stubborn streak, it'd still be called Goose Flats. Yet he did. And now, over 100 years later, people are still showing up, still curious, and they're still chasing ghosts.